the news that net migration to the UK has reached record levels, rising to 330,000 in the year to March. The Immigration Minister, James Brokenshire, has said the new figures are deeply disappointing. Well, we can get reaction now from the UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, who's in our Westminster studio. Very good morning to you. Mr Farage, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Many aspects to this issue to talk about today. The drivers for that increase in net migration almost equally split between EU and non-EU migrants. Part of that Britain can't do anything about, part of it it can. Do we need new ideas?
Yeah, we do. What we need to have is an Australian-style point system where we don't discriminate against people from outside the EU in favour of unconditional free movement to those inside the EU. And we need to draw the terms of who we want much more clearly. I mean, you know, if we have a skills shortage within the UK economy, then fine, let's have people coming into Britain. At the moment, we simply don't do that. And what we're seeing, of course, and the reason that the numbers coming from the EU are now very much bigger than the numbers coming from the rest of the world, is we've admitted countries like Bulgaria and Romania into a political union with us. Now, you know, I said 2 years ago this would lead to a very large number of people coming into the country. I was laughed at, but I'm afraid it's proved to be true. Because look, the minimum wage in Britain is 9 times higher than the minimum wage in Romania. So these are the main drivers.
The figures for people coming in from the EU actually slightly lower than non-EU migrants, but only just. I mean, would you agree with the Institute of Directors, though, when it says that this drive by the government to bring down the net migration figure is damaging business because the people with the right skills aren't getting through?
Well, there is a partial truth in that. Because an engineer from India or a doctor from New Zealand now finds it quite tough to get to Britain, whereas unlimited numbers of unskilled labour from southern and eastern Europe can just freely come. So there is something in that. But look, here's the problem. You know, the Institute of Directors represents business. He wants his firms to employ people on the cheapest possible labour, and he couldn't give a damn about the fact that we have a chronic shortage of primary school places, that our National Health Service cannot cope with a population rising as rapidly as this, and that we have to build a new home every 7 minutes in Britain just to cope with the increase in population caused by immigration. So I accept that big business wants unlimited labour, but the other side of that is the change to our communities, the pressure on our public services, and the extent to which the wages of ordinary British people have been compressed. And I honestly believe that if we had an immigration system where we could control the quantity and quality of who comes to Britain, your programme would not need to discuss immigration ever again, because we'd all feel fairly happy with it.
A short while ago, though, your colleague Stephen Wolfe was talking about the idea of zero immigration for low-skilled workers for 5 years to bring about a rebalancing, but that's still not going to address the issue of people coming from within the EU who are low-skilled, is it?
We have a big opportunity as far as the EU debate is concerned. The government and the previous government have always denied the truth. They've always said we do have control over who comes to Britain from Europe, when of course the truth is that we don't. However, if the Prime Minister is going through a renegotiation of Britain's membership of the European Union, if he's going to convince us to vote yes, then what he needs to do is to change his tack and to put free movement of people and our ability to control our borders at the centrepiece of that renegotiation.
Looking at that wider issue of the migrant crisis that we're seeing unfolding across Europe now, and of course we can't conflate those scenes directly with these latest figures on net migration into Britain, but do you hold any hope of this conference in Vienna, this summit in Vienna, coming up with any useful ideas when there is already such a flow of people into Greece, into Hungary, people who are trying to move northwards into Northern Europe, indeed into the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke on this in April, you know, face to face with Mr Juncker, the President of the European Commission, in April. What the EU have done is they've implemented a common asylum policy. The difficulty with it is that the terms of who qualifies for asylum are set so broadly that, frankly, it extends to countless millions. And we're beginning to see a sort of biblical exodus of people crossing the Mediterranean, knowing that they will all be accepted when they get to Italy or get to Greece. And so we've now got this massive debate going on about burden sharing within the European Union, because under Schengen, most of those people go straight to Germany, and Chancellor Merkel is under pressure. I think the EU have got this fundamentally wrong. I think the terms for their asylum policy are set too wide. They even include people who come from poor countries. Well, frankly, that's almost the whole of Africa.
So you're saying that there's got to be a toughening up of asylum policy. That's more realistic, do you think, rather than expecting individual EU countries to all accept their fair share of people?
Well, the problem with burden sharing is that the politics in the north of Europe is changing very quickly. I mean, in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats are now the lead party in the opinion polls, and they have a very strict view on numbers that should be admitted to Sweden. We've seen a Conservative party with tough immigration views come second in the general election in Denmark. Much the same is happening in the Netherlands and certainly in France. You know, no one can deny how strong the Front National under Marine Le Pen are. So the north of Europe politically find it pretty much impossible, their governments, to accept burden sharing. My argument, though, is more fundamental. I think the EU's common asylum policy is flawed. It never foresaw the events in North Africa and the Middle East. And what they need to do is to look at the example of the Australians, who in 2008 faced very much the same crisis, with boats of people coming to Australia, boats capsizing, people drowning, all the same things that we've seen over the course of 2015. And the Australians just said, look, you will not get into Australia if you come via this route. They were absolutely clear about it, and the boats stopped coming.
OK, Nigel Farage, thank you.
Well, let's talk more about what's been proposed in Strasbourg. Joining me from there, the UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, who we saw in that earlier report a few moments ago. Nigel Farage, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You were in the chamber there for what Jean-Claude Juncker had to say, and he talked about the issue being a matter of humanity and human dignity, and put forward this proposal for quotas to 22 EU countries. What do you think?
What I think is this, that from April it was clear that Jean-Claude Juncker was going to implement the EU's common asylum policy. The problem with that policy, as I tried to point out at the time, is that it casts the definition for who qualifies way beyond the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugee Status, and even includes people who come from poor countries. So what we're seeing is this huge tide of humanity coming across the Mediterranean, taking massive risks, being in the hands of the criminal traffickers and ISIS and all the rest of it. And what we're not doing is we're not sorting out who are genuine refugees and who are not. So to ask me to comment on what I think of the Juncker plan to distribute 160,000 people around the rest of Europe, my answer is, why don't we get back to the basics? Why don't we find out who a refugee is, who a refugee isn't? And surely the only way we can stop the drownings and stop the exploitation is to stop the boats coming by having offshore reception centres where we can assess people.
Right, well, let me follow you down that road in that case. How do you define a genuine refugee in this context?
Dead easy. We've been doing it, actually Britain's been doing it for about 350 years, and it's been codified since 1951. A refugee, by definition, is an individual in direct fear themselves of persecution because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or political or social beliefs. That is what a refugee is. And we've known that and understood that. And if you look at the people that have come to Europe over the course of the last year, the vast majority of them would not qualify, with the best will in the world, for being refugees.
Even those fleeing the civil war in Syria?
Well, hang on. Most people who've come to Europe have not come from Syria. And the problem now is because Angela Merkel has really, inflated the original message that came from Jean-Claude Juncker 6 months ago. Now anybody can come to Europe, throw their passport into the Mediterranean and say they've come from Syria. So we're just not getting this right, and we're not sorting out who are the genuine refugees. And by the way, I do believe that Britain and the rest of Europe have a duty to help genuine refugees, but not for us to be an open door to economic migrants.
No, I accept that you've made that point about genuine refugees before.
Yeah.
I want to get this idea of these these centres that you're talking about, which will sort this all out, which are not in Europe? Where are you going to put them?
Well, what I'm keen to do, number one, is stop people drowning. And you stop people drowning if you tell them that if you come by this route, you will not be accepted. This is exactly what Australia did back in 2008. Now, I'm actually quite pleased that the British government, for once, have not got along with the European line and have said that we will take refugees, but take them directly from the camps. Now, it's perfectly clear there are very big camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Turkey. Interestingly, there are 6 other wealthy Arab states who are refusing to take a single person. So I'd like to see a bit more effort and emphasis put on them. But I do think that David Cameron, for once, has listened to the arguments, and the European Union need, I think, to go along with that model. The problem is, what I heard today from Mr. Juncker in his State of the Union speech is they refuse to accept they've got anything wrong. And I now genuinely believe that my prediction that we will see a flow of people into Europe of biblical proportions will come true.
Can I also put to you what Mr. Juncker said with regards to wider reform? Because he talked about the need for more fundamental change in the way we deal with asylum applications, not, I suspect, necessarily along the lines that you've just outlined, but he made that point. And he said, and notably the Dublin system that requires that asylum applications be dealt with by the first country of entry. Now, what's your response to that specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that was very interesting. I mean, look, since 1951, we've accepted internationally that you claim refugee status in the first safe country you come to. Mr. Juncker wants to ditch that because he doesn't want to actually recognise that Italy and Germany or Britain are different countries. We're all part of the European state with one flag, one anthem, one police force, ultimately one army and one asylum policy. What he also said is he will come back next March or next April, not just with an asylum policy, but with a common EU immigration policy.
Right, but just on that specifically, according to EU figures, since the Dublin rules were agreed 12 years ago, asylum applications in Britain have stabilised, and Britain's share of Europe's asylum claims has declined from about 10% in 2008 to, I think, 5% last year. So, I mean, do you acknowledge those figures for a start?
Well, we are fortunate. There are 2 very wise things Britain did. One was say no to the euro, thank goodness, and the other was to say no to Schengen. And that's why, now anyone that gets into Greece or Italy or Hungary can freely go to Germany without their details being checked. They can't get to Britain through the same means, which is why you've got the camp at Calais. So, however much we've suffered over the summer, and Kent's businesses have suffered, our problems are as nothing compared to countries like Germany that are stuck in Schengen.
One more, if I may, because you talked about you want to stop the drownings. Everybody wants to stop the drownings. We are where we are. People are prepared to take enormous risks to get across the Mediterranean in appalling conditions. Whatever measures you take longer term are not going to stop the drownings tomorrow. So what will you do in the immediate term to try and arrest this situation?
I'm sorry, I don't agree with the premise of that question. If you look at many of the people, not all, but many of the people that are coming to European territory, they are paying thousands of euros to people smugglers to get across to mainland Europe.
Because they're desperate.
If they knew, if they knew that on arriving in Kos or in Lampedusa or indeed in Hungary, that they would simply be refused entry, they would not spend that money, and they would not put their lives in the hands of very dangerous criminal gangs and traffickers. And this is exactly what Australia faced back in 2008, and the Australians said, if you come through this route, we guarantee you one thing, you will not be accepted. And that was the way the Australians stopped the drownings, and nobody would call Australia a country that was closed.
Good to have your thoughts. Thank you very much for coming on. The leader of UKIP, a member of the European Parliament, of course, as well, Nigel Farage.